All right, so this will be a quick overview video of the third lab manual. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to peruse this information, and really it's nothing new. You know, in the second lab unit, we did muscles and bones and articulations of the appendicular skeleton. And so in this third lab unit, we're doing pretty much the same thing we did in lab unit 2, muscles, bones, and articulations, except this time with the axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton is your core. It's like your skull and your vertebrae and your sternum and your ribs, and all the muscles, or not all, but a subset of the muscles associated with those bones. And so that's what we're going to do in this unit. So if you had success last time, sort of rinse and repeat just with different muscles and bones. And that's how this is going to run. So again, hopefully you've had a chance to look at this. I uploaded sort of a somewhat trimmed down version geared specifically just to using images. And so I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that in terms of what they have to do. All right, so the first set of slides is going to be related to the skull. And the first thing you have to identify are all the sutures. And sutures, if you recall, we talked about this back early on in the semester. Sutures are where bones come together and fuse, and they leave a suture line. And so there are 4 primary ones you want to know: coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal, and squamous suture, and all those are listed in these images here. So if I ask you about those, I would use one of these images for the sutures. Then you just roll through all the bones. Your bones, again, if you recall, are several bones that have fused together: frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, sphenoidal bone, etc. And so, kind of like we did with the appendicular skeleton, we were able to identify the bone itself, but then also identify different sites on these bones. So for instance, the frontal bone, the first bone we're looking at, is right here, right? Frontal bone, sort of your forehead or front of your skull. In that region. And there are 2 sites you have to identify: the supraorbital margin and the frontal sinus. And so you just use your picture and find those sites, and that's how we'll test you on that. Supraorbital foramen, you can see right here, points right to this little notch on the sort of the top of your eyebrow, if you will. There's one over here as well. Okay. And then the frontal sinus is a sinus, which is listed right here, that creates a little cavity within that bone. So those are the 2 sites you need to see for the frontal bone. Parietal bone are just the 2 sort of bones above the that attach to the frontal bone. If you look at this picture, you can see go back to the previous bone. You can see a picture of the parietal bone there. So again, you should be able to see all the things you have to identify within the slide, but if not, you may have to jump around a couple slides to be able to find it exactly, but I think you should be able to, for the most part, see them on the same page. All right, then you move on to the temporal bone. Temporal bone is this bone sort of on the side of our skull, and there are lots of different sites you're going to be looking at with the temporal bone. As you can see them all listed here, from squamous to petrous region. And those have all been listed here. A lot of openings you're going to be identifying, like the carotid, the foramen, the lucerum. So you want to make sure you have all those different sites. So all the sites that are listed in this box, right, that's what you want to be able to identify for the temporal bone. And so just roll through those, find those on your images. And again, you may have to hop around a slide or 2 to find every single one, but you should be able to find all of them within these images. And then you move on to the sphenoid bone. Looks like you have about 5 sites you need to identify in the sphenoid bone. And I've included several images, all of which I could use on the exam to identify those. But again, I've included the pictures have a lot more sites to identify. You just need to identify the things that are listed within that box. All right. And you just continue on to the ethmoid bone, which is the color-coded green one. It has this little sort of shark's fin that sticks off from the bone called the crista galli. Olfactory foramina as well, which you can see little openings on the bone to allow for olfaction to occur, or smell. And then you move on to the occipital bone, which is the back of your skull, essentially has this very large opening called the foramen magnum, which is an opening to obviously connect your brain to your spinal cord, which you're learning about now in the lecture slides. And then there are several other sites you want to have listed or know that you can identify that are listed in the box up here. So we want to make sure you get all those. All right. Facial bones, the maxilla. There's several sites within the maxilla that you want to identify. The mandible, your jaw, has several sites as well. So I've tried to include several pictures there so you can identify all these different features. Should be pretty straightforward. And then you have some smaller bones, like there's a zygomatic bone is your, what you probably refer to as your cheekbone. Lacrimal bone is sort of you can see it listed here as this red bone just inside your eye socket, has a little hole in it to allow for drainage from the lacrimal gland, which also you'll learn a little bit more about later on when we do the eye. Bony nasal septum is your, the thing that divides your nose into two chambers. The vomer and the perpendicular plate combine together to form that. The perpendicular plate forms the upper portion of the nasal septum, and the vomer forms the lower portion of the nasal septum, which you can see listed in that picture. So you want to make sure you have all that. And that's it for the skull. So those are all the different sites you want to be able to identify, and I'll use those pictures to test you on the lab exam. On to the vertebral column. Basically, what you're going to be identifying with the vertebrae are, first of all, you want to understand that there are three different general classifications of vertebrae, primarily cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. And there are 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then the sacrum and the coccyx make the final portion of the vertebral column. And so you want to identify a lot of features that we find pretty much on all the vertebrae. So we just call this a general vertebrae. Things like vertebral body, right, which is the main mass of the vertebrae, or the spinous process, or the transverse process. Vertebral canal, pedicles and lamina, which create the neural arch, things like that. You should be able to see on all of these pictures that I've included here, that again, can typically be found on all the vertebrae, whether it's cervical, thoracic, or lumbar. Then if you move on to the next slide, I want you to identify some specific things. First, you want to know that there are 7 cervical vertebrae. And the 2 that I want you to focus on specifically of those 7 are the first 2, C1 and C2. C1 is also referred to as the atlas, because this is the vertebrae that articulates with the skull, with the occipital condyles of the skull. And so it's called the atlas, right? It's sort of like holding up the world, right? The atlas. So it articulates there. And then beneath that, the first cervical vertebrae articulates, of course, with the second cervical vertebrae, which is also referred to as the axis. And the axis has this dens or odontoid process that C1 sits on and can sort of pivot around that point, that ends or that axis in that location. And so we talked about that when we were looking at the different types of articulations. So this sort of being a pivot joint, allowing for that motion to occur. All right, so that's what you want to know about the cervical vertebrae. Thoracic vertebrae, there's nothing really specific there that I want you to know. They do get a little bit thicker as they move down. There are 12 of them. That should be good. And then the lumbar vertebrae, again, nothing really unique that I need you to know there. They do, again, get thicker, so a little bit larger as they move down to the lumbar vertebrae, and there are 5 of those. But really, most of the features that we want to talk about are the things that we typically see on the general vertebrae, which, again, you can see on a lot of these different structures. So that should cover those. All right, sacrum should be pretty straightforward. You have a base and an apex, etc. Coccyx, pretty straightforward. You should have no problem identifying those. And then on to the thoracic thoracic cage that protects the organs within the chest cavity. Things like the sternum, right? You want to be able to identify these different features on the sternum, which is some people refer to as their breastbone, right? This bone here in the middle. Want to identify those sites, the different ribs. There are 12 pairs. And I want you to know these different features like head, neck, tubercle, body, sternal end, etc. You should be able to see all those because these ribs articulate at two sites, right? They articulate at the sternum, right? But then they also articulate back on the vertebrae. They articulate in two spots on the vertebrae, at the transverse process typically, and at the vertebral process. So that's typically where those articulate on the back side. On the front, they just have a sort of a sternal end that articulates with the costal cartilage, as you can see here. All right. So that's it for the rib. And then it's on to the muscles. The muscles, you guys know the drill here. You need to be able to identify the muscle, right, on these pictures, and then also give me origin, insertion, and action. So for instance, the first one is the frontalis, which is this muscle right here, right? It's the one that sort of attaches to your forehead and to your eyebrows and raises your eyebrows, essentially. And so that's the first one. And you want to just continue on. Orbicularis oculi, which you can see on that picture. Orbicularis oris, buccinator platysma, so forth and so on. Of course, you obviously need to identify all the different actions, origins, insertions as well. And so there shouldn't be anything too tricky here. Masseter and temporalis, you can see on these pictures here. Pterygoids, you can see in this picture. Digastric sternocleidomastoid, you can see there. Muscles that move the ribs. Rectus abdominis and external oblique. Internal obliques. Trapezius, which is sort of an upper back muscle. And then finally, the splenius and erector spinae group, which you can see here. Now, what's important to understand, usually there's a question about this, is that these erector spinae group run the length of the spinal cord. And so, for instance, on the iliocostalis, right, you're going to see, for instance, a thoracic version of the iliocostalis and a cervical version of the iliocostalis, right? You just need to be able to identify the one. And for instance, the iliocostalis is the one that's most lateral of these erector spinae muscle group. The longissimus is the next medial, and the most medial is the spinalis. So again, you don't have to worry about identifying a thoracic version of that muscle versus a lumbar version of that muscle. It's just identifying those three muscles. And I'll use this picture here to the right. All right, so that I believe is it in terms of all the slides. Hopefully that was helpful in your preparation. But again, it's pretty straightforward since you guys have done it before in terms of doing the muscles and actions, origin, insertions, and bone sites, etc. It's just this time we'll be using pictures instead of the models as we go through this. All right.